I follow this sort of pattern about, how does the various bar exercise mirror or reflect the themes that I saw emerging. For me, in a bar, battement tendu and battement dégagé are very much about establishing direction. Where is devant? Where is à la seconde? Where is derrière? And very soon in the school's development, Betty Oliphant, who was the principal of the school, set out to establish standards. And those standards encompassed not only what was being taught in the studio, but also the academic standards, and on top of that, how the students were expected to comport themselves and to behave. So I talk about the rules and regulations. And some of us who were around in the early years will remember, that, for example, there was a very strict guideline about the length of your skirt. And the mini skirt was coming in the 60s, and some of us would, roll up and try to make it a little bit shorter. And Mrs. Howarth, who was the academic principal, or someone else would come along and say, kneel so I can see how long that skirt is, and if it's not touching the ground when you're kneeling, it's too short. And so we would have to, unfurl our skirts or whatever. But there was also regulations around we had to wear our uniforms every day, including Saturdays, because there were classes on Saturdays. And I always felt a little odd when I was a day student, because I used to take transit. I lived out in Scarborough. And I'd be on the streetcar or the bus on a Saturday morning in uniform, and I would look decidedly out of place. And I always had this thought that people thought, oh, well, maybe she's not too sure it's Saturday. But in any event, we would try whatever means we could to, get out of wearing uniforms, or if it was really hot or really cold, maybe we could get out of wearing the wool socks and the skirts and all that. But despite all that, there was somehow an understanding that we were really cared about, and that at NBS, I always felt it was a family. And even when, as students, we felt like, we were the families maybe rebelling a little bit against mom and dad, and, we don't want to do it exactly this way, we knew that they cared about our well-being. And sometimes there were things that went on in the early years of the school that would no longer take place. And Betty Oliphant was very open about some of those practices later. So, for example, the weekly weigh-in. I remember standing down in the lunchroom and taking off your shoes or whatever else you felt you could take off, your blazer, your sweater, feeling that thinking that might make a difference. And it was for some students very, very traumatic to go through that. But at the time, there was not that understanding that there is today about maybe why that wasn't such a good idea to enforce that upon young female dance students in particular, who are very impressionable and who might make unwise decisions about weight and how to control their weight and about what is that ideal. And not talking so much about the importance of it's the nutrition. It's that you have to have a healthy body because you're exercising a lot. And without that proper nutrition, you're more prone to injury, for example. And your future development, your future growth can actually be negatively impacted. So, lots of things in the school's history over time have evolved in very positive ways. And I think that's all for the good. And it's like all of us through life. We learn as we go. And the school also, and some of the practices they've learned as they've gone through. So far, so good. The other really exciting part, I think, about those very early years, in addition to setting standards, was from the very beginning, Betty Oliphant reached out, particularly to the international community, so that, by the second, third year of the school, visitors from the Kirov and the Bolshoi ballets, when they were touring in Toronto, came to the school, taught classes at the school, and immediately were highly, highly impressed with the quality of the teaching and the quality of the students that they saw. So much so that when Betty Oliphant approached the Bolshoi about having a teacher come to the school to teach here for an extended period of time, they agreed. And back in the early 60s, politically, it was a very different time. And there was a lot of negotiation that had to go on between the Canadian ambassador, the Canadian government, and the Soviet government at that time. But in 1963, November 1963, Eugene Velukin, who you see here with Patricia Oney, he did come. He taught from November until January, and the students, I was not at the school yet at that time, but I know that his presence here had such an incredible impact on the students who were here, because I did come shortly after that, the following summer, and students were still talking about it, and they had their Russian point shoes. And Betty Oliphant was always very, very open to bringing in the ideas from the Russian school of teaching and the Danish school. And she was very, very open, even though we had that grounding in the Cicchetti and that British foundation. It wasn't just that we had. We had national dance, character dance. There was Spanish dance. I actually had some classical Indian dance while I was here. So there was always that reaching out, understanding that in order to produce the best dancers, they must have a range, a broad range of understanding of dance forms and a respect of a range of dance forms. I think I'm going to skip the rest of the bar work and just very quickly, this is of course 111 Maitland Street, the Quaker Meeting House, which was the only building that the school was in on opening day in September 1959. The studios were here. The academic classrooms were in here. The administrative offices were in here. It was tight. It was very, very tight. And very quickly what happened as the numbers expanded, I mean, as I said, there was only 26 students that first year. But by 1963, it had already tripled to 75 students. So very, very quickly, they needed more space. So the school gradually began to expand and to acquire properties along Maitland Street. And you can see here on the left, there's 113, which became an academic building. On the right, 105, which housed some classrooms, a couple of resident students actually at one time as well as some administrative offices. So in this middle period, basically what happens is there's this explosion of students. As the school's reputation grows, more and more students are auditioning. And there was always that commitment that any student or potential student who had the talent, the school wanted to be able to take in. So they needed to have scholarships, as well as they needed to have the physical spaces. So there were tremendous pressures placed on the board of directors to fundraise, to have capital costs covered in order to acquire new buildings and new spaces. And it was relentless. It never, ever stopped. And I think the people who were on the board in those years, all of us have to extend our thanks to them, because they just worked tirelessly to figure out how could they bring in the money in order for the school to grow and to provide the spaces. And by the end of this period, 75 to 89, what has happened is the school has that entire block of Maitland Street by about 1975. And when the school celebrated its 25th anniversary in 1984, Betty Oliphant, her desire that she expressed, the one thing she really wanted that she didn't yet have was a theater. Mm-hmm. And of course, we're sitting now in the Betty Oliphant Theater, which opened in 1988. So by 1989, which is the end of this sort of period of huge transitions and financial pressures, we have magnificent, or, well, not magnificent. We have space. Some of it's pretty old space, but we have space. We have a wonderful theater, but we also have about $1 million deficit by 1989. And this, of course, is when Mavis, 1989 is when Mavis took the reins of being artistic director with this very large deficit, which is a huge challenge for her. And in 1991, Bob Sermon joins her. I just want to see at the theater here. So you can, we're sitting in the new seats, by the way, which are, again, a tribute to the ability of the school to raise money and to be able to refurbish spaces.